CNN's Anderson Cooper reporting after the July 16th joint press conference with Trump and Putin. I asked Noam Chomsky for his response to the Helsinki summit.
Trump has basically one principle, me first. That's almost all of his policies and wild statements and so on are perfectly well explicable under the assumption that that's what's driving him. Now, that crucially for him, he has to ensure that the Mueller investigation is discredited. Whatever they come up with, if it implicates him in any way, the way the media and political culture function, that will be considered of enormous significance, much more significance than his pursuing policies on the environment which may destroy human civilization. But given that those highly skewed circumstances, he has to make sure that the Mueller investigation is discredited. And that was the main core part of his interview with Trump, putting aside the way he behaved, the soccer ball, which apparently had a listening device embedded in it and so on. Yes, that was strange and
well, actually, that soccer ball, that particular ball has that little device in it, and that's how it's sold. It was a World Cup soccer ball, and that's what that's one of its attributes that people like, that they can put their iPhone next to it and get information.
Yeah, well, Putin was plainly treating Trump more or less with contempt. So whatever you think about that, nevertheless, his main concern was pretty obvious, and that was the central part of the Putin-Trump interviews. And so, yeah, I think I just don't see the great significance of his acting in a silly and childish way in an interview. Okay, he did. Now let's go to the important issues which are not being discussed. The issue of improving relations with Russia is of overwhelming significance as compared with remarks saying, well, I don't know whether to trust my own intelligence agencies. For saying that for perfectly obvious reasons, to discredit the Mueller investigation and to ensure that his fervently loyal base stays supportive. That's not an attractive policy, but we can understand very easily what he's doing.
Those intelligence agencies, former CIA Director John Brennan tweeted, Donald Trump's press conference performance in Helsinki rises to and exceeds the threshold of high crimes and misdemeanors. It was nothing short of treasonous. Not only were Trump's comments imbecilic, he is wholly in the pocket of Putin. Republican patriots, where are you? Again, the former CIA Director John Brennan's tweet. No.
Well, his remarks were certainly incorrect. Whatever you think of Trump's behavior, it has nothing to do with high crimes and misdemeanors or treason. That's just not true. But again, the same point I've been trying to make throughout. We are focusing on issues of minor significance and putting aside problems of enormous importance and significance, whether we're thinking of how to deal with immigration or whether we're dealing with the question of survival of organized human life on Earth. Those are the topics we should be thinking about, not whether Trump misbehaved in a press conference.
Noam Chomsky, I wanted to ask you about NATO. President Trump has questioned a key provision of the NATO military alliance, the mutual defense of NATO member countries. He made this remark during an interview with Fox News host Tucker Carlson just a week ago.
why should my son go to Montenegro to defend it from attack? Why is that?
I understand what you're saying. I've asked the same question. You know, Montenegro is a tiny country with very strong people.
Yeah, I'm not against Montenegro or Albania.
No, by the way, they're very strong people. They're very aggressive people. They may get aggressive, and congratulations, you're in World War III.
There's President Trump questioning the whole idea of NATO. Well, if you could specifically address this, interesting, he chose Montenegro, where, well, many months ago when he was with the G7, the G8, he pushed aside the prime minister of Montenegro. But the bigger point about, well, he wasn't making this point, but I'd like to ask you about whether you feel NATO should exist.
That's the crucial question, not whether Trump made an ugly and demeaning comment about a tiny country, but what is NATO for? From the beginning, from its origins, we had drilled into our heads that the purpose of NATO was to defend us from the Russian hordes. We can put aside for the moment the question whether that was accurate. But in any event, that was the dominant theme, overwhelming, in fact, unique theme. Okay, 1991, no more Russian hordes. So the question is, why NATO? What happened was very interesting. There were negotiations between George Bush the First, James Baker, Secretary of State, Mikhail Gorbachev, Genscher and Kohl, the Germans, on how to deal with this was after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev made an astonishing concession. Astonishing. He agreed to allow Germany, now unified, to join NATO, a hostile military alliance. Just look at the history of the preceding years. Germany alone had practically destroyed Russia at an extraordinary cost several times during the preceding century. But he agreed to allow Germany to rearm Germany to join NATO, a military alliance that was set up to counter Russia. There was a quid pro quo, namely that NATO meaning NATO means basically U.S. forces, and not expand to East Berlin, to East Germany. And nobody talked about anything beyond that. Baker and Bush verbally agreed to that. They didn't put it in writing, but they essentially said, yeah, we will. In fact, the phrase that was used was not 1 inch to the east. Well, what happened? NATO immediately moved to East Germany. Under Clinton, other countries, former Russian satellites were introduced into NATO. Finally, NATO went so far as I mentioned before, 2008, again 2013, to suggest that even Ukraine, right at the heartland of Russian strategic concerns, any Russian president, didn't matter who it was, any Russian leader, that they join NATO. So what's NATO doing altogether? Well, actually, its mission was changed. The official mission of NATO was changed to become control and safeguard the global energy system, sea lanes, pipelines, and so on. And of course, on the side, it's acting as an intervention force for the United States. Is that a legitimate reason for us to maintain NATO? To be an instrument for a U.S. global domination? I think that's a rather serious question. That's not the question that's asked. The question that's asked is whether Trump made some demeaning comment about Montenegro. It's another example of what I was talking about before, the focus of the media and the political class and the intellectual community in general on marginalia, overlooking critical and crucial issues which do literally have to do with human survival.
Noam Chomsky, now linguistics professor at the University of Arizona, Tucson. Coming up, we'll talk to him about climate change, nuclear weapons, Israel, Gaza, and more. Reputation by Joan Jett here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we return to our conversation with the world-renowned political dissident, professor, linguist Noam Chomsky.
We can't overemphasize the fact that we're in a unique moment of human history. In fact, we have been ever since 1945. 1945, human history changed dramatically. August 1945, humans demonstrated that their vaunted intelligence had created means to destroy life on Earth. Didn't quite have it yet at that point, but it was obvious that it was going to extend and expand as it in fact did. A couple of years later, 1947, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists established its famous doomsday clock. How far are we from midnight, terminal disaster? It was set at 7 minutes to midnight. It once reached 2 minutes to midnight, 1953, when the U.S. and then the Soviet Union detonated thermonuclear weapons, which do have the capacity to essentially destroy life. Then it's oscillated variously. It's now back at 2 minutes to midnight. With an addition, it was not known in 1945 that we were not only entering the nuclear age, but entering a new geological epoch, what geologists call the Anthropocene, an epoch in which human activity is having severe and deleterious effects on the environment in which human and other life can survive. We also entered into what's now called the sixth extinction, rapid extinction of species, which is comparable to the fifth extinction 65 million years ago when a huge asteroid hit the Earth. We know the World Geological Society finally settled on the end of World War II as the onset of the Anthropocene, sharp escalation and destruction of the environment. Not only global warming, carbon dioxide, other greenhouse gases, but also such things as plastics in the ocean, which are predicted to be greater than the weight of fish in the ocean not far in the future. So we're destroying the environment for organized human life. We're threatening a terminal disaster with regular nuclear confrontations. Anybody who's looked at the record, which is shocking, would have to conclude that it's a miracle that we've survived this long. Human beings right now, this generation, for the first time in history, have to ask, will human life survive? And not in the far future.
Now,
will organize society. So those are the issues we should be concerned with. These are everything else pales in significance in comparison with this. And going back to NATO, well, what is it doing? It expanded to the Russian border. If you take a look at Trump's policies from a geostrategic point of view, they're totally incoherent. I mean, on the one hand, he's making nice to Vladimir Putin. On the other hand, he's escalating the threats against Russia and hence to ourselves as well. Arms to Ukraine, serious threat to Russia, increasing forces at the Russian border. The Russians are doing the same on the other side. Military maneuvers, the new nuclear program which he's instituted, which is a severe threat to Russia and indeed the world. Already under Obama, the modernization programs had reached the level where they were posing a literal first strike threat to Russia. That's important work on that has appeared in the scientific journals, Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Trump is escalating it. Even more modernization of extremely dangerous forces. Also significantly lowering the threshold for nuclear war. Also new weapons, which are supposedly tactical nuclear weapons, which are, as any nuclear strategist can tell you, are just incentives for escalation to final disaster. These are enormous threats against Russia, ourselves as well, combined with being polite to Putin at a press conference. Geostrategically, this makes no sense.
So, I mean,
it all makes perfect sense.
Trump has gone after
a different assumption.
Trump has gone after NATO allies from, Britain to Germany, and before that, Macron in France, and as well as Trudeau in Canada. But he also, while questioning NATO, says he's questioning because he simply wants them to spend more money, and actually named the weapons manufacturers in the United States that he wants them to spend more money on, saying they should spend 4% of their budgets on weapons. If you could comment on this.
In other words, if you're looking for a serious strategy behind this, you're looking in the wrong place. That's not what lies behind it. None of this makes sense from a strategic point of view. None. It's all contradictory and coherent and so on. That should tell us something. Let's look somewhere else. And it all makes perfect sense on the assumption that he's driven by one overwhelming concern, himself. All of this makes sense for a megalomaniac who wants to make sure that he has power, he has wealth, has to appeal to a number of constituencies to make sure he's supported. One constituency is the overwhelmingly hawkish establishment, expand NATO, build up the military system, modernize nuclear weapons, and so on. Okay, he's got them in his pocket. The crucial constituency is, and his actual one, are the corporate sector and the super rich. And he's just lavishing gifts on them while he's prancing in front of the media, and the media are helping him out by focusing on him. His minions in Congress are carrying out sheer robbery. I mean, it's unbelievable if you take a look at it point by point. I've mentioned a couple of examples before. Then he has to maintain a voting base, otherwise he's out. And he does that by posturing. I'm going to I'm going to confront NATO, make them pay more so they won't be robbing us anymore. Great. I'm going to confront China, stop stealing our intellectual property. Great. I'm going to put tariffs on everybody. I'm defending you guys, workers' rights. Point by point, it all falls into place. And I think that's pretty much what's going on.